In the heart of a glittering city, one unexpected encounter would change 3 lives forever. What began as a quiet launch event would uncover truths no one was ready for, and at the center of it all stood a little girl with a courage bigger than the room call to action, stronger alternate. Stick with me until the end. This is a story you won't forget. And while you're here, tap like and subscribe so you never miss the next one. Asterisk. The revolving glass doors of Grant & Co. as headquarters spun lazily in the morning rush, ushering in a stream of polished shoes, pressed suits, and murmured conversations about quarterly targets. Sunlight poured through the towering panes, catching the gleam of the marble floors until the whole lobby looked like a cathedral built for ambition. No one noticed the girl at first thought. She stood just inside the entrance, her scuffed black shoes planted firmly on the white marble, her small hands wrapped around the straps of a faded pink backpack. Her honey blonde hair was divided neatly into 2 pigtails, tied with sky blue ribbons that matched the dress she wore. It wasn't just any dress. The creases were crisp, the collar perfectly white, the kind of care only someone else could have put into it. She clutched a worn leather portfolio that seemed far too heavy for her arms, and her wide eyes swept the lobby like she was trying to memorize every inch of it before she took another step. Harrison was 7 years old, and she was here for a job interview. She drew a deep breath the way she'd practiced the night before and marched toward the reception desk. The woman behind it, all sharp lines and smooth efficiency, didn't look up from her computer until Emma stood on tiptoe to peer over the counter. "Excuse me," Emma said, her voice small but certain. "I have a 9 o'clock appointment with Mr. Alexander Grant." The receptionist blinked, her fingers still on the keyboard. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. Are you lost? Where are your parents?" "My mom is Rebecca Harrison. She has an interview today, but she can't be here." Emma set the portfolio on the desk with both hands, as though presenting something fragile. "I'm here instead." The woman's brows knitted. "That's not how interviews work, honey. Your mother needs to come herself." "She can't," Emma interrupted softly. "She's in the hospital." Her words wavered, but she pressed on. "She got sick last night, but she really needs this job." A tall figure in a charcoal gray suit had stopped a few paces away, arrested by the sound of that small, determined voice. Alexander Grant rarely paused for anything in the mornings. At 46, with a silvered edge to his dark hair and a reputation for efficiency so sharp it cut, he was not in the habit of being late. But now his gaze fixed on the girl in front of the desk, her chin tilted up in defiance of the odds stacked against her. "What's the situation here?" His voice carried, smooth and deep, the kind that could command a room without rising in volume. The receptionist turned quickly. "Mr. Grant, this little girl says she's here for the project. Manager interview in place of her mother." Alexander stepped closer, studying the child. "And your name?" "Emma Harrison, sir." Her eyes met his without flinching. "My mom says it's important to look people in the eyes when you talk to them." Something in the steadiness of her gaze tugged at a place inside him he'd long thought sealed. "And where is your mother now?" "Northwestern Memorial Hospital. The doctors say she'll be okay in a few days. She has pneumonia, but she stayed up all night working on her presentation before she got sick." Emma unzipped the portfolio, revealing neatly organized papers and a USB drive tucked into a sleeve. For a moment, Alexander simply watched her. He'd conducted thousands of interviews in his career, many with people twice her age who could barely muster this level of composure. Logic told him to hand her back the portfolio and wish her mother a speedy recovery. But logic was suddenly quiet. "Emma Harrison," he said at last, extending a hand. "I've never done this before, but let's hear what your mother prepared." The receptionist's mouth fell open as Alexander gestured for Emma to follow him to the executive elevator. As the polished doors slid shut, Emma tilted her head up. "Mom says I'm too young to." "Drink coffee," she offered, "but I know how to make it if you'd like some." For the first time in longer than he could remember, Alexander Grant laughed. Not the polite, practiced sound he gave at networking events, but a genuine laugh. That startled even him. He had no idea that this small interruption to his carefully ordered day was about to change everything. The elevator ride was silent, except for the soft hum of the machinery, the numbers above the door ticking upward. Emma stood very straight, the leather portfolio hugged to her chest, her wide eyes darting between the glowing floor indicator and the towering man beside her. Alexander Grant's presence was the kind that made even seasoned executives adjust their posture. But the little girl didn't seem afraid, only curious. When the doors opened on the top floor, the air felt different. Quieter, thicker, the carpets muted every footstep, and the wide hallway stretched toward double glass doors etched with his name. Alexander pushed them open, gesturing her inside. Emma's small gasp was almost imperceptible. The office was vast, framed by floor-to-ceiling windows, spilling light across a dark walnut desk that looked large enough to land a small plane on. Behind it, the city of Chicago glittered, steel, glass, and motion. The walls bore magazine covers with Alexander's face and shelves lined with awards that gleamed like captured sunlight. "Sit," he said gently, motioning to the chair across from his desk. She climbed up, legs dangling, and placed the portfolio neatly on her lap. "All right," Alexander began, lowering himself into his chair. "Tell me about your mother's qualifications." Emma's fingers unzipped the portfolio with practiced care. "My mom's been a project manager for 8 years," she began, her voice steady. "She worked at Westlake Solutions until they closed last month. She has a PMP certification and an MBA from Northwestern University." Alexander's brows rose slightly. For a child to speak with such precision was unusual. "And why does she want to work at Grant & Co.?" Emma looked him square in the eye. "Because we need the health insurance," she said simply, "and because she says your company does important work that helps people." He leaned back in his chair, caught off guard by the directness. Most candidates buried their true reasons under rehearsed speeches about company culture and growth opportunities. This girl cut straight to the truth. "She's very good at her job," Emma added, opening a folder of documents. "These are her success stories. She made this presentation last night, before she went to the hospital. She was coughing a lot, but she didn't stop working until it was done." Alexander reached for the papers, scanning the pages. Detailed project reports, budget breakdowns, timelines that ran like clockwork. Whoever Rebecca Harrison was, she was thorough. "And who's taking care of you while she's in the hospital?" he asked, still flipping through. "Our neighbor, Mrs. Winters," Emma said. "She's nice, but she's old, so I make my own lunch and go to school on my own." Something inside Alexander shifted. "And your father?" Emma's tone was casual, almost rehearsed. "He left when I was a baby. Mom says he wasn't ready to be a dad. It's just us. But we're a good team." The sunlight streaming through the windows caught her face in profile, the stubborn tilt of her chin, the quiet resilience in her eyes. It tugged at a part of him he didn't let anyone near. He set the papers down and pressed his intercom. "Janet, cancel my morning meetings." A pause crackled through the speaker. "Sir, you have the quarterly board briefing at 11. Reschedule it," he said. "And find out which doctor is treating Rebecca Harrison at Northwestern Memorial Hospital." Emma's head tilted. "Are you going to visit my mom?" "We are," he replied. Rising from his chair, he moved around the desk and held out his hand. "Come on. Why are you helping us?" she asked as they walked toward the door. Alexander hesitated. That was the question, wasn't it? Because, he said finally, you've done something most of my executives can't. What's that? You've got my full attention. Emma smiled, a small, knowing smile, and placed her tiny hand in his. The warmth of it startled him, and for the briefest moment, he felt something stir deep in the locked rooms of his heart. Neither of them knew it yet, but this wasn't going to be a normal interview. It was the beginning of an entirely different kind of story. The black sedan slid into the hospital's drop-off lane, its glossy finish reflecting the gray morning light. Alexander stepped out first, his shoes clicking against the pavement, then turned to help Emma down. She clutched the leather portfolio. Like a lifeline, her small frame dwarfed by the sheer bulk of the building rising above them. Inside, the hospital was alive with motion, nurses wheeling carts, the rhythmic beep of monitors drifting from open doors, the faint smell of antiseptic. That clung to everything. Alexander moved with his usual measured stride, but there was an unfamiliar weight in his chest. This wasn't a boardroom. There was no agenda he could control here. The nurse at the front desk barely looked up from her computer when he asked. For Rebecca Harrison. Room 317, she said. But visiting hours haven't started. Alexander slid a crisp business card across the counter. It's an urgent business matter, he said, his voice even but carrying the kind of authority that made people reconsider rules. The nurse's eyes flicked to the name on the card, and her posture shifted. She waved them through. Emma led the way down the corridor, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the linoleum. Alexander noticed how naturally she navigated the turns. Too naturally. It made him wonder how many times she'd walked these halls. How many late nights she'd been here when other kids were home in bed. They stopped at a half-open door. Inside, Rebecca Harrison sat propped against a pillow, an IV line snaking into her arm. Her chestnut hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, her face pale, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. And yet there was something in the set of her shoulders. A quiet defiance that hadn't been touched by illness. Emma's voice was soft. "Hi, Mom." Rebecca's head turned sharply. "Emma, you're supposed to be with Mrs. Winters." Her gaze landed on Alexander, and confusion flickered into alarm. "Oh my God, Mr. Grant?" Before Emma could speak, Rebecca's attention darted back to her daughter. "What is going on?" I went to your interview," Emma said, words tumbling over themselves, "and he brought me to see you." Rebecca's eyes widened, and color drained from her face. "You did? What?" She tried to sit up straighter, wincing. Alexander stepped forward. "Your daughter presented your portfolio to me this morning." With remarkable poise. Rebecca's lips parted, but no words came out at first. Then she found them, sharp, tinged with worry. "Emma, we talked about this. You were supposed to call the company to reschedule, not. You worked so hard on your presentation," Emma blurted, her chin trembling. "And we need the job." The honesty in her voice filled the room like a tidal wave. Rebecca's eyes softened just for a moment before she turned to Alexander. "I am very sorry for the trouble she's caused." "No trouble," he said quietly. "I was impressed. And I'd like to hear more from you." Rebecca hesitated, then glanced toward the portfolio in Emma's lap. 8 years as a project manager. Certified. Consistently exceeded targets. But I've been turned away from 8 interviews in 2 months. "Why?" Alexander asked. Her eyes didn't waver. "Because I'm a single mother. No family support. Employers don't say it outright, but they make it clear they think I'll be unreliable. They don't see efficiency or experience. They see complications." Emma climbed gently onto the bed beside her mother, checking the 4-line without being told. Alexander noticed. "The medical bills aren't helping," Rebecca added, her voice dropping. Pneumonia couldn't have come at a worse time. Something in Alexander tightened. Memories threatened to surface, memories of another woman years ago, trying to fight her way back into the workforce. Of doors closing on her, one after another. He stood suddenly. "How soon will you recover?" "The doctor says I could go home tomorrow, but I won't be at full strength for a week." "Then we'll conduct your official interview next Monday," Alexander said. He reached into his jacket, pulling out a card. "In the meantime, have the hospital billing department call this number." Rebecca's eyes narrowed. "Mr. Grant." "I can't consider it in advance," he interrupted. "Grant & Co. takes care of its people." Emma's hand found his as they turned to leave. "Thank you for helping my mom," she whispered. Alexander glanced back at Rebecca, who was watching him with something between disbelief and guarded hope. And for the first time in years, he felt the unsettling certainty that this right here was going to change him in ways he couldn't yet see. The following Monday, the hum of Grant & Co.'s executive floor was different, subtle but noticeable. Assistants typed a little slower. Department heads spoke in quieter tones. Everyone had seen the black sedan pull up to the building just after lunch and the CEO himself step out, not alone, but with a small girl in a sky blue cardigan walking beside him like she belonged there. Emma Harrison, 7 years old, carried herself as if she'd been born in a boardroom. Alexander had arranged for her to spend afternoons in a vacant corner office just a few doors down from his own while her mother recovered. It was a temporary arrangement, he'd told himself, just until Rebecca was back on her feet. Still, he'd instructed his assistant, Janet, to have the space set up with a child-sized desk, a laptop for educational use only, and a steady supply of chocolate milk. By 2 o'clock, Emma was settled in, her backpack hanging neatly from the chair. But it took less than 30 minutes for her presence to ripple through the floor. First came the marketing team. They'd stopped by to say hello and somehow ended up showing her their latest campaign mock-ups. "I like the design," Emma said after a moment's study, "but the colors might be too dark for kids my age. Bright colors make things feel happier." They laughed politely at first, until she explained why. If it's about helping families, shouldn't it look like it's for them too? By the time they left, they were already debating new palettes. Next was finance. She'd overheard 2 analysts discussing supply chain costs in the break room, and, in her straightforward way, suggested, "Why not talk to the vendors about bulk discounts? My mom says they work if you're nice to them." It was absurd. It was simple, and it was exactly the kind of thing Alexander's executives should have thought of. From his office, Alexander watched these small disruptions with quiet fascination. He was used to people treading carefully around him, filtering their words, measuring their tone. Emma didn't filter anything. She didn't know the rules, and she didn't care to learn them. And somehow, instead of chaos, she brought clarity. Still, not everyone was charmed out by the third day. Whispers began to circulate. Why was the CEO bringing a child into the executive suite? Was this about her mother's pending job offer, or something more personal? Victoria, the HR director, passed Alexander in the hall with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. That afternoon, he found Emma in the corner office, feet swinging as she worked through math problems. "How's your mother today?" he asked, leaning against the doorframe. "Better," Emma said, not looking up from her paper. "The doctor says she can go home tomorrow." She paused, then added, "Will you still want to see me after she starts working here?" The question caught him off guard. "What makes you think I wouldn't?" Emma shrugged, pencil still moving. "Sometimes people stop wanting kids around, like my dad." The words landed like a blow he hadn't braced for. He thought of the silver-framed photograph hidden in his desk, the one he never took out during the day, the one with his wife and daughter, frozen in a moment that could never come back. Before he could respond, Janet appeared at the door, a subtle warning in her eyes. "Sir, Victoria has requested a meeting with you tomorrow morning," she says. "It's urgent." Alexander nodded, but a shadow crept into his thoughts. Urgent meetings with Victoria rarely ended well for anyone. And if she was circling Rebecca's hiring, or worse, targeting Emma? He glanced back at the little girl bent over her notebook, unaware of the storm quietly gathering around her. For reasons he couldn't yet articulate, Alexander knew one thing with absolute certainty. If anyone tried to hurt her, in this office or outside of it, they would have to go through him first. Late that night, the executive floor was dark, except for the soft pool of light spilling from Alexander Grant's office. The city outside his windows shimmered in 1,000 pinpricks of white and gold, but his gaze was fixed on something far smaller, the silver frame sitting dead center on his desk. He reached for it slowly, almost reluctantly, as though touching it might release something he'd kept locked away for too long. Inside was the photograph of his wife, Caroline, laughing with their 2-year-old daughter in her arms. Lily's hair was a pale halo in the sun. Her tiny fingers curled in her mother's blouse dot. It had been 17 years. And still, every time he looked at it, the same questions returned. All the things he could have done differently. All the things he should have seen sooner. The accident had been sudden, cruel, final. But the years before it, those had been a slow erosion he'd helped cause without even realizing it. Caroline's fight to rejoin the workforce after Lily's birth had ended in a string of polite rejections and closed doors. And while she'd been fighting, he'd been building his empire, thinking success for him was security for them both. Until one rainy afternoon, security meant nothing at all, Dot. He set the photo down and leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking. Softly in the stillness, the little girl in his office now, Emma, had stirred something he'd buried with Lily. The same tilt of the chin, the same unflinching way of looking at him, as though he wasn't the most powerful man in the room, but just a man, and that made her dangerous. Not to him, but to the fortress he'd built around himself. A sharp knock at the door broke his thoughts. Janet stepped in, her face drawn tight. "Sir, Victoria stayed late tonight. I thought you should know she's been in the HR archives." For hours, Alexander's eyes narrowed. Looking for what? I don't know. But she wasn't exactly subtle about slamming the cabinet drawers. Janet hesitated, then added, "And she had Harrington with her." The name hit like the first crack of thunder before a storm. Gerald Harrington, former CEO, current board member, and a man who considered Alexander's leadership style a drift from tradition. Translation: he hated anything that deviated from the cold, rigid culture he'd built. Alexander stood, the tension coiling in him like a steel spring. "Get me everything on my desk tomorrow morning. Every requisition, every internal memo. She's touched in the last 30 days. When Janet left, he stayed by the window, watching the reflection of the city on the glass. He could feel it, the shape of the opposition forming. Harrington and Victoria didn't just want to block Rebecca's hiring. They wanted to use it as leverage, to paint him as compromised, personal, weak. And in corporate politics, perception was often deadlier than truth. He thought again of Emma in her little corner office, challenging marketing directors and finance analysts without even realizing she was doing it. He thought of Rebecca in that hospital bed, answering his blunt questions without flinching. They were both trouble for people like Harrington, which meant they were already in the crosshairs. Alexander exhaled slowly, his mind moving to the next morning's confrontation. This wasn't just about keeping them safe. This was about the culture of the company itself, and whether it would evolve or be dragged backward. Somewhere deep down, he recognized the irony. For years, he'd been the man who never allowed personal attachments to dictate business. Now, for the first time, it wasn't the numbers that mattered. It was the people behind them, and he was willing to go to war for them. By the time Alexander stepped into the boardroom the next morning, the air already felt charged, a thin, invisible current that prickled against the skin. Harrington was there, sitting at the far end like a spider in the center of his web, flanked by Victoria on one side and two of the board's more conservative members on the other. Their voices hushed when Alexander entered, but the smug curve of Harrington's mouth told him they'd been discussing him right up until the moment the door opened. The rest of the table was a mix of allies and neutrals. James Whitfield, his CFO and one of the few people Alexander trusted implicitly, sat with his arms folded, eyes tracking the undercurrents, as if preparing for a chess match. Alexander didn't take his usual seat at the head. Instead, he walked the length of the table, stopping just behind his chair and resting both hands on it. He let the silence stretch, not awkward, but intentional, the kind of silence that made people shift in their seats and reevaluate their first moves. "Let's get to it," he said. "You called this meeting. Make your case." It was Victoria who spoke first, her tone carefully balanced between deference and attack. "Alexander, concerns have been raised about recent, unconventional practices in the executive suite. Specifically, the presence of a minor child in the workplace and the acceleration of policy changes that appear to be tailored to an individual employee's circumstances." "You mean Rebecca Harrison?" Alexander said flatly. "Yes," Victoria replied, not missing a beat. "We have equally qualified candidates for the project manager role, candidates without complications." "Complications?" His voice had dropped a register, quiet but edged with steel. "A single mother with recent medical emergencies," Harrington cut in, pretending to be matter of fact. "We can't afford to make personnel decisions based on sympathy. That's not how you run a top-tier firm." Alexander's gaze locked on Harrington's. "Sympathy isn't a factor. Performance is. And in case you've forgotten, Harrison's track record is superior to most in her field." Harrington leaned back, lacing his fingers. "This isn't about one hire. It's about the direction of the company. In the last 60 days, you've implemented flexible schedules, remote work allowances, and on-site accommodations, all without proper vetting or board approval. You're reshaping the culture based on your personal attachments." There it was. The unspoken accusation made spoken. Alexander could feel the shift in the room. Board members leaning forward, waiting to see how he'd handle it. He stepped around the table slowly, stopping near Victoria. "You want to talk about culture? Let's talk about a culture that punishes talent for having a family. Let's talk about a culture that thinks innovation is only worth pursuing if it doesn't make anyone uncomfortable. And while we're at it, let's talk about the kind of leadership that hides behind words like tradition to justify exclusion." Victoria's lips tightened, but Harrington's smile didn't falter. If anything, it widened. Fine speeches don't change the fact that perception matters. And the perception right now is that you're compromised. We've had calls from clients asking if Grant & Co. is running a daycare. Investors want stability, not experiments. "Investors want results," Alexander said, his voice like a blade now. "And the numbers are already proving this works." "That's not enough," Harrington replied. "Which is why we're putting forth a motion this Friday to begin a leadership transition, an advisory role for you, while we appoint someone who can restore balance." The room went still. For the first time, Alexander saw the move clearly. They weren't just trying to stop his policies. They were trying to take the company from him entirely. James broke the silence. And who would this someone be? No one answered, but Alexander didn't need them to. The way Harrington's eyes flicked to one of his supporters said it all. Alexander straightened, scanning the faces around the table. "You want a fight," he said. "You'll get one. But understand this. I've built this company to be more than a monument to the past. You tear down what I've started, and you'll find yourselves competing against it. From the outside, Harrington's smirk faltered, just slightly. Alexander turned and left without another word, the glass doors swinging shut behind him. But as he walked back toward his office, a single thought gnawed at him. They wouldn't just attack him in the boardroom. They'd go after the people around him, Rebecca, and Emma, and that, more than the threat to his position, was what made his hands curl into fists. By the time Alexander stepped into the boardroom the next morning, the air already felt charged, a thin, invisible current that prickled against the skin. Harrington was there, sitting at the far end like a spider in the center of his web, flanked by Victoria on one side and two of the board's more conservative members on the other. Their voices hushed when Alexander entered, but the smug curve of Harrington's mouth told him they'd been discussing him right up until the moment the door opened. The rest of the table was a mix of allies and neutrals. James Whitfield, his CFO, and one of the few people Alexander trusted implicitly, sat with his arms folded, eyes tracking the undercurrents as if preparing for a chess match. Alexander didn't take his usual seat at the head. Instead, he walked the length of the table, stopping just behind his chair and resting both hands on it. He let the silence stretch, not awkward, but intentional, the kind of silence that made people shift in their seats and reevaluate their first moves. "Let's get to it," he said. "You called this meeting. Make your case." It was Victoria who spoke first, her tone carefully balanced between deference and attack. "Alexander, concerns have been raised about recent, unconventional practices in the executive suite. Specifically, the presence of a minor child in the workplace, and the acceleration of policy changes that appear to be tailored to an individual employee's circumstances." "You mean Rebecca Harrison?" Alexander said flatly. "Yes," Victoria replied, not missing a beat. "We have equally qualified candidates for the project manager role, candidates without complications." "Complications?" His voice had dropped a register, quiet but edged with steel. "A single mother with recent medical emergencies," Harrington cut in, pretending to be matter-of-fact. "We can't afford to make personnel decisions based on sympathy. That's not how you run a top-tier firm." Alexander's gaze locked on Harrington's. "Sympathy isn't a factor. Performance is. And in case you've forgotten, Harrison's track record is superior to most in her field." Harrington leaned back, lacing his fingers. "This isn't about one hire. It's about the direction of the company. In the last 60 days, you've implemented flexible schedules, remote work allowances, and on-site accommodations. All without proper vetting or board approval. You're reshaping the culture based on your personal attachments." There it was. The unspoken accusation made spoken. Alexander could feel the shift in the room, board members leaning forward, waiting to see how he'd handle it. He stepped around the table slowly, stopping near Victoria. "You want to talk about culture? Let's talk about a culture that punishes talent for having a family. Let's talk about a culture that thinks innovation is only worth pursuing if it doesn't make anyone uncomfortable. And while we're at it, let's talk about the kind of leadership that hides behind words like tradition to justify exclusion." Victoria's lips tightened, but Harrington's smile didn't falter. If anything, it widened. Fine speeches don't change the fact that perception matters. And the perception right now is that you're compromised. We've had calls from clients asking if Grant & Co. is running a daycare. Investors want stability, not experiments. "Investors want results," Alexander said, his voice like a blade now. "And the numbers are already proving this works." "That's not enough," Harrington replied. "Which is why we're putting forth a motion this Friday to begin. A leadership transition. An advisory role for you while we appoint someone who can restore balance." The room went still. For the first time, Alexander saw the move clearly. They weren't just trying to stop his policies. They were trying to take the company from him entirely. James broke the silence. And who would this someone be? No one answered, but Alexander didn't need them to. The way Harrington's eyes flicked to one of his supporters said it all. Alexander straightened, scanning the faces around the table. "You want a fight," he said. "You'll get one. But understand this. I've built this company to be more than a monument to the past. You tear down what I've started, and you'll find yourselves competing against it." From the outside, Harrington's smirk faltered, just slightly. Alexander turned and left without another word, the glass door swinging shut behind him. But as he walked back toward his office, a single thought gnawed at him. They wouldn't just attack him in the boardroom. They'd go after the people around him. Rebecca and Emma. And that, more than the threat to his position, was what made his hands curl into fists. The envelope arrived with no return address, no messenger's signature. Just a thick, cream-colored packet left on the corner of Alexander Grant's desk while he was in a meeting with the legal team. Janet swore she hadn't seen who delivered it, and if that was true, it meant someone had gone to considerable lengths to make sure this reached him quietly. He shut the office door, slid the brass letter opener under the flap, and tipped the contents onto his desk. Board meeting minutes. Internal memos. Confidential HR summaries. All dated from nearly 2 decades ago. Back when Harrington ruled Grant & Co. with an iron fist and a smile that never reached his eyes. The first few pages were dry. Notes on quarterly profits. Lists of promotions. Then, buried between 2 innocuous reports, he saw her name, Carolyn Grant, wife of CFO Alexander Grant. Request for part-time return for maternity leave. Denied. In the column marked reason, someone, Harrington, by the handwriting, had written, "Sets dangerous precedent for executive spouses. Recommend discouraging reapplication." Alexander felt the muscles in his jaw go rigid. He read on, the ink blurring in places where his vision sharpened to an almost painful clarity. There were lists, actual lists, of female employees who had given birth while employed at Grant & Co., annotated with notes like "monitor" for reduced commitment and encourage exit within 18 months. The memos were worse. Carefully worded directives to HR, disguised as productivity initiatives, outlining performance metrics designed to push out employees with family obligations. While we cannot openly discriminate, we can structure deliverables in a way that favors unencumbered staff. He flipped to the last page and found a clipping from a newspaper. The accident that had taken Caroline and Lily. Attached was a sticky note in Harrington's precise block script. Tragic outcome. Ensure Ag remains focused on work. Best distraction from grief. The paper trembled in his hands. For years, Alexander had believed the greatest failing of his marriage was his own distraction. His inability to be present while Caroline fought her battles alone. Now he saw the truth. Harrington had been the architect of her professional exile. He had made sure she would never win. And Alexander had been too blinded by ambition to realize it. A sound broke the silence. A soft knock on the door. Rebecca stepped in, a question on her face that died the moment she saw the documents spread before him. "What is all this?" He told her. Slowly at first, then with rising force, the story poured out. The policies, the memos, a personal note about his wife's death. Rebecca sat across from him, her expression shifting from shock to fury. "This isn't just a fight over me," she said quietly. "This is a history of discrimination against every working parent who's ever walked into this company." Alexander nodded. "And it's been buried for 20 years. Rebecca leaned forward, her voice steady and deliberate. "Then we don't just take this to the board. We take it to everyone, clients, media, the industry. We don't give them time to spin it. We define it first. For a moment, he studied her. The fire in her eyes, the conviction in her voice. It was the same quality Carolyn had carried into every challenge. The refusal to let a system grind her down. If we do this, he said, there's no going back. It will become public war. Then it's war, she replied. He closed the folder with a decisive snap. The path ahead was dangerous, and Harrington would unleash every weapon he had left to protect his legacy. But Alexander felt something he hadn't felt in years. Clarity, laced with purpose. This wasn't about saving his position anymore. It was about rewriting the culture of the company from the ground up, and finally laying to rest the ghosts that had haunted him since. The day he lost Caroline and Lily, somewhere out there, Harrington thought he was tightening a noose. Alexander intended to make sure it became his own. The boardroom was silent in the way a battlefield is silent just before the first shot, breath held, body still, but tension humming in the air like a drawn bowstring. Every seat at the long mahogany table was filled. Harrington sat at the far end, his fingers steepled, wearing the calm smile of a man convinced the outcome had already been decided. Victoria was gone, discarded after her last misstep, but Harrington had gathered his loyalists, 3 veteran board members whose votes had always followed his lead. Alexander didn't sit right away. He stood at the head of the table, a slim black folder in one hand. His eyes swept the room, meeting each gaze without flinching. You've all heard the rumors, he began. You've all seen the headlines. But what you haven't seen, what none of you were ever meant to see, is the truth about where this company came from, and the cost of pretending the truth doesn't exist. He laid the folder flat and opened it. The first page was a photocopy of an internal memo, enlarged so the handwriting at the bottom was unmistakable. Gerald Harrington, signed in thick black ink. This, Alexander said, his voice cutting through the stillness, is a directive issued under Mr. Harrington's tenure. It details how Grant & Co. would, quote, ensure workforce stability by creating performance metrics designed to push out employees with family obligations. A ripple passed through the board. Harrington didn't move. Alexander flipped. Another page. This is a list of employees who became pregnant during their tenure. Every single one was gone within 18 months of returning from maternity leave. One of the newer board members shifted uncomfortably. These are from years ago. Alexander didn't let him finish. Decades old, yes, but the consequences of these policies are still shaping this company today. And in one case, his gaze locked on Harrington. The consequences were personal. He held up the next document, Caroline's denied request to return to work part-time. My wife wanted to come back. She was told no, that it would set a dangerous precedent. His tone hardened on the words, the contempt sharp enough. To cut, she never got another chance. She died believing her career had been her mistake, when the mistake was trusting this company to value her. A heavy silence followed. Even Harrington's supporters weren't meeting his eyes now. Alexander leaned forward, placing both hands on the table. I've spent the last 17 years carrying the guilt for not supporting her. But I've learned something in the last week. Her failure wasn't hers. It wasn't even mine. It was engineered. Harrington finally spoke, his voice cool. Business decisions aren't personal, Alexander. That's what you've forgotten. No, Alexander said softly, but his words carried across the table. What I've remembered is that every business decision is personal to the people. It affects. You built a culture that punished people for having families. I'm building one that rewards them for being human. Rebecca stepped forward then, uninvited but unshaken, carrying a stack of reports. The Family Forward initiative has increased productivity by 22% in participating departments. improved retention rates, and cut sick day usage. Those are facts, and they come from a culture that values families. Alexander let her words hang for a moment before turning to the rest of the board. So here's the motion I'm putting forward. Make the Family Forward initiative permanent, company-wide, and remove Gerald Harrington from this board, effective immediately. The room erupted into overlapping voices, some shocked, some angry, some quietly approving. Harrington's chair scraped back as he rose, his calm cracking. For the first time, "You can't, I can," Alexander said, "and I will." James, the CFO, spoke next. "I second the motion." The vote was swift, brutal, and public. 11 in favor. 3 opposed. Security appeared at the door, waiting for Harrington to step away from the table. His parting look wasn't one of defeat. It was something darker, the promise of a man who would not go quietly. But Alexander didn't care. For the first time since he'd inherited this company, the air in the boardroom felt cleaned out as the door closed behind Harrington. Alexander looked around the table. "We're done pretending the past didn't happen. From today forward, Grant & Co. will be known for what we choose to build, not what we chose to hide." There was no applause, no victory cheer. Just the slow realization among those present that the ground beneath them had shifted and there would be no going back. The winter sun slanted through the lobby's glass walls, catching in the brushed steel letters that spelled out Grant & Co., but the building didn't feel like the same place it had been a year ago. The marble still shone, the air still carried the quiet hum of high-stakes business, yet there was something warmer in the way employees greeted each other now, a looseness in the conversations that once had been clipped and cautious. Today, the lobby had been transformed. Banners hung from the mezzanine, each emblazoned with a new name, the Grant Family Foundation. A stage had been built near the reception desk, its backdrop a montage of photographs, not glossy stock images, but candid moments of employees, with their children, grandparents, and partners. Alexander stood behind the curtain just off stage, hands clasped loosely in front of him. He could hear the growing murmur of the crowd, not just his staff, but clients, industry leaders, and members of the press. This wasn't a shareholders' briefing. This was something new, something public, and the air buzzed with the weight of it. Rebecca stepped up beside him, her navy dress crisp, her shoulders squared. She'd been named the foundation's first executive director, though she'd fought him on it for weeks before finally relenting. "You've built this," she had told him during one of their quieter arguments. "I don't want to be here because you owe me anything." "You're here," he'd replied, "because you've already been doing the work. I'm just giving you the platform." Now, standing side by side, they looked out at the packed lobby. Emma was darting between rows of chairs, handing out program brochures with the concentration of someone managing a Fortune 500 client list. She wore a small badge she'd made herself, Chief Testing Officer, and pinned it proudly over her cardigan. Alexander's mind wandered for a moment, unspooling the thread that had led him here, from a chance encounter in this very lobby, to the hospital visit, to the brutal boardroom battle that had ended Harrington's reign. And the envelope. Always the envelope. The truths it had forced into the light had nearly burned the company down, but in the ashes, they built something. Stronger? Ready? Rebecca's voice was calm, but her eyes searched his for the flicker of nerves she'd learned to read over the past year. He let a slow smile crease his face. "We've been ready since the day she walked in with that portfolio." The MC's voice rang out. "Please welcome Alexander Grant, CEO of Grant & Co., and Executive Director of the Grant Family Foundation, Rebecca Harrison." The applause swelled as they stepped into the lights. Alexander took his place at the podium, the microphone picking up the quiet hitch of his breath before he began. "Not long ago," he said, "a 7-year-old girl walked into this lobby. clutching her mother's resume. She said she was here for her mom's interview because her mother was in the hospital and because she needed the job. A ripple of recognition moved through the crowd. Many had heard the story by now, but never from him. That morning changed my life, he continued. I'd built a career on numbers, efficiency, and results. But I'd forgotten that behind every result is a person, a life, a family. Emma reminded me that family isn't a liability in the workplace. It's our greatest asset. He glanced toward Emma, who was perched in the front row, her chin resting on her fists as if she could hold the weight of the moment still. The Grant Family Foundation will help companies across the country design workplaces that work for families. We'll share the data. We'll provide the resources. And we'll prove that compassion and profit are not opposing forces. They're allies. The applause was louder this time, but he raised a hand to quiet it. I want to thank Rebecca Harrison, who stood beside me when it would have been easier to walk away, and Emma Harrison, who stood in front of me when I didn't yet know I needed her there. Rebecca stepped to the microphone. Her voice was steady, but Alexander could hear the undercurrent of steel. We are here to make sure no parent has to choose between their career and their child. And we're here to make sure no child grows up believing they are the reason their parent couldn't succeed. The crowd rose to their feet, the sound swelling and echoing against the glass and stone. In that moment, Alexander reached for Rebecca's hand. She didn't hesitate. From the front row, Emma's voice cut through the din, clear, unfiltered, and perfectly timed. Does this mean we're family now? Laughter rippled through the audience, but Alexander didn't look away from Rebecca. Her eyes were bright, her hand warm in his. We've been family, he said, his voice low enough that only she and Emma could truly hear it, since the day you both walked into my life. And as the cameras flashed and the manor swayed, overhead, Alexander realized the war was over. Not just the one in the boardroom, but the war he'd been waging with himself for 17 years. For the first time in his life, the future didn't feel like a deadline. It felt like a beginning.